Hello and welcome to CollectaThought, the show where I collect my thoughts on a video game. And today we're gonna be reviewing Stubbs the Zombie in Rebel Without a Pulse. Or as everyone and myself is gonna be referring it to, just Stubbs the Zombie. And this was originally a Xbox game, but also had a PC and Mac release, so not an exclusive technically, but a very Xbox branded game, especially since one of its major selling points that was even on the cover was that it ran on the Halo engine. And maybe above that, even though not explicit on the cover, was that this was actually made by a team of former Bungie employees, with the goal of creating a smaller and cheaper game in what was at the time and still is today the problem of the growing development costs in the video game industry. So the first thing you need to know about Stubbs the Zombie is that it's not a AAA game, but it was never meant to be. And I hope you take that into consideration, as I do kind of criticize this game in a lot of ways. Starting then with the story, it is a bit weirdly convoluted for such a simple story. Here you play as Stubbs, of course, and he kind of just shows up out of nowhere and starts creating havoc as he's trying to reach this girl he loves. It is a very simple story, but for some reason there's a lot of just stuff that randomly happens without seemingly any reason. And at the end of the story, it actually all kind of makes sense. Like, for example, there's this hillbilly farmers level, and at first I just chucked it out to being kind of a cliche of its time, given games like Destroy All Humans also had levels like that. And even in movies, Home on a Range, Chicken Little, what was up with farms in the early 2000s? But regardless, it's a very simple story for a very simple game, and to be fair, I think if you created something too complex in a story about a zombie being the main character, then, you open yourself to a lot more scrutiny. But as it stands, it's a silly game with a silly story, and it's fine. I chuckled sometimes. In terms of gameplay though, this is where I think a lot of my goodwill towards this game kind of dissipates. Not because it's a bad game, but because it's a very thoroughly mediocre one. Starting with the basic combat, Stubbs can do a couple of things. Early on, he can eat brains, creating zombies that will fight for you, and he can do melee combat, which is very basic. And I think in a joke this game does, I think it's somewhat self-aware. It might not be, but it seems like it. When you get close to a ranged enemy, sometimes they'll say, "I hate melee combat," which is cute but doesn't make the combat any better. Also, while the idea of creating zombies that fight for you is really cool, the way it's done here is kinda lame. Mostly because of how the game is designed, making these zombies rather ineffective most of the time. They really end up being just cannon fodder, and the reason for that is most enemies use ranged weapons. In fact, I found that most scenarios in this game are actually more about figuring out how to get close to the enemy rather than the act of killing the enemy itself. This is also kind of connecting with what I think is kind of very disappointing level design. It is mostly big, linear, open levels with some cool settings that I think are lacking in detail. As the game takes place in a retro-futuristic setting, it's like the 60s, but it's the future at the same time. Which is a cool setting, especially as this game is, of course, spoofing on a lot of the horror and sci-fi genres of the time. But once again, I wish they had done more with it. Now, going back to the zombies you create, you can influence their direction. I found that to be just a bit too tedious, as they're not particularly fast, and once again, they'll end up being just cannon fodder anyway. Yes, they can overwhelm a group of enemies, but usually there's a faster and better option. Leading us to talk about Stubbs' other abilities. The first ability is a very 2000s party humor kind of ability. It's a fart. and it works like a flashbang basically. It disorientates the enemies, making it so you can just hit your finisher on them, and that being eating their brains, turning them into zombies as well. Characters, by the way, will turn into zombies regardless of if you eat their brains or simply kill them with melee combat. But what I have noticed is they will not turn into zombies in other very specific ways, like for example, if you run them over with a car. Yes, there are vehicle sections in this game and they feel like Halo, and like Halo, they drive with the mouse, which is very funny. Regardless, the other one is throwing your organs at people, because for some reason your organs are explosive, so this is like the ranged grenade weapon. And these two are kind of the more simple and somewhat normal weapons, but with a zombie theming to it. Now the next two are what I think really make this game kind of stand out in a positive way and make it a lot more interesting to play as well. The next one being the hand. This basically allows you to throw your hand and control it remotely, and while in this mode grab onto enemies and control them. So basically you can, for example, throw your hand at a cop, grab him, and then you can control him and use his gun. This is probably the most overpowered ability in the game, especially towards the end, as the hand can control pretty much every enemy in the game besides bosses and enemies in vehicles. Usually the only downside is if you pick up someone in the middle of a crowd, then the AI is very simplistic and we will just auto aim at you immediately. And if you die, you return to your body. But if you don't die, then you get to control that for as long as you want, and you can go through almost through a whole level sometimes, with the only downside being that these characters can't run. To give you an idea, one of the things I did was grab a guy with a bazooka, run through the whole level, get to the end of it, then grab a car and drive all the way back to go get Stubbs, the main character. Another couple things adding to the overpoweredness of the hand is also that it's the fastest regenerating item in the game, given you regenerate the hand by eating the brains of an enemy, which is something you do a lot, as you can probably guess, so you almost always have the option to use the hand. Then our final power, also very powerful but a lot more nerfed, is the power to use your hand as a bowling ball. This is very powerful because it is a one-hit kill while you're in this bowling head mode, and at the end of it you will also explode, which will also be an insta-kill for anyone in range. The only thing nerfing this power is the fact that it takes a whole long time to recharge, unlike the hand. And the combination of these four powers actually is what makes Stubbs the zombie tolerable, or even at points enjoyable, because the game really lacks in the level design. Once again, it is mostly just open areas that go straight, and the enemies as well aren't very varied, being mostly people with guns. But because these powers are so unique, they allow you to play around and experiment a bit. That being said, because of what these powers are, I legitimately think something that would have helped a lot would be just more enemy variety in each level, since such a big part of it will be controlling these enemies. The other big thing for me, I think, and maybe this was a limitation of the time, this was before even Dead Rising, but something I think would have helped a lot would just be have much bigger enemy counts or zombie counts in general. If you could just have a giant army of zombies, then suddenly them being cannon fodder wouldn't even matter. Maybe that would make the game too easy, but the response to that would also just be throwing a lot more enemies as well. Maybe creating like a crazy mix between Destiny Warriors and Total War. I think that would have been cool. And maybe that was the goal and the Xbox just couldn't run it, so who knows. Another minor problem I had with the graphics was simply that sometimes it was kinda weirdly hard to tell zombies apart from people who were alive. Which sounds weird, but it happened quite often actually, and the reason for that is a bit the stylistic choices of the game. It can be very muted in terms of color, going for a very greenish tone overall, which, can work sometimes and once again, not some other times, creating problems like this. Overall, as it stands, the gameplay is enjoyable, but also repetitive, and it kind of helps that it is a very short game, which also you have to take into consideration that it is a fairly short game. Now, in terms of visuals, it is a budget title, but it actually looks pretty good. The character models are detailed, the world is nice to look at, even if I think it needed more detail. I mean, even just some props in the middle of levels would have helped. It really feels open, but also empty at the same time. That being said, this game still looks nice. I'm not sure how much was done for this remaster. It does really just seem to be like an HD port, which in my opinion feels warranted since this game was quite hard to find before this version came out, or at least find at a decent price. But more on that in a bit. Now let me finish this off with the soundtrack, which I only mentioned because it was weirdly distracting how there wasn't a soundtrack for a lot of the game, to the point where I thought it was a bug, but I checked other people's playthroughs and it seems to be normal. And this is probably another budget thing, but it is distracting. Sometimes there'll just be complete silence and it's a bit awkward. And I think it kinda ends up adding to my problem with the levels of being too open and empty. I think it makes that stand out even more, which isn't good. It gets to the point where I would forget I wasn't listening to anything and then a character will talk out of nowhere and surprise me. I know this is definitely a budget issue and I don't want to pry on it too much, but it is something you should be aware of. Regardless of any of that though, is Stubbs still a worthy game despite it being a budget game from the early 2000s that hasn't aged amazingly in the gameplay department? Well, yes, it hasn't aged greatly, but it still has a lot of unique things about it in the gameplay department that make it quite enjoyable today, and that you don't get to see a lot even. I mean, even throughout the early 10s with the big boom of zombie media, there wasn't a whole lot of games that let you play as the zombie. And it still has a lot of value to it despite its budgety feel. And for all those reasons, I am giving Stubbs the Zombie in Rebel Without a Pulse a 6 out of 10. In terms of your recommendation, if you get this game for cheap, and I'm talking like under 15 bucks, then absolutely give this one a shot. If you pay more than that, I don't know if it's worth it, because it is at the end of the day a rather short game, and even in that short time it is a rather simple game. But I know a lot of you probably got this game for free in the Epic Games giveaway, so in that scenario, yes, go play it. I'm sure you'll get some enjoyment out of it. But that's about it. It's really just a case of, did you get the game for cheap? Then you'll probably not feel bad about it. Personally, I could not see myself buying this game before this remaster simply for the purpose of playing it, given how expensive it used to be. Collectors are crazy. Anyways, regardless of any of that, I hope that you enjoyed watching, and if so, please consider subscribing, liking and commenting all the things you can do for free here on YouTube. And regardless of that, I hope you're having a good day, and goodbye, for real this time.